Hey there, we are going to be reading and annotating this letter in 1938 from F. Scott Fitzgerald, who is the author of The Great Gatsby. And he's writing this letter to, and you can see at the top here, college sophomore Francis Turnball. She had sent him one of her pieces of writing. She was an aspiring writer. And normally, right, if you think about it, here's F. Scott Fitzgerald, who is very famous, well-known, accomplished, published writer, considered one of the top writers at the time. And normally, a college sophomore would not have access to be able to say to this level and caliber of author, hey, what do you think of my writing? However, there's this little caveat there. It's a family friend. And so she does have access to him and is able to send him, as a friend of the family, a sample of her writing to get feedback on. And so this is a letter in response to her request and her writing that he wrote. And so when you think about the rhetorical triangle, right, there's some wrinkles here in terms of nuance that F. Scott Fitzgerald is balancing this. I'm a family friend, and so I'm not going to totally crush and destroy her if her writing is not good. But also, why is she writing me? Well, because I'm an accomplished author, and she wants my opinion. And so I have to balance the fact that I know what I'm talking about with the fact that we're also family, and I'll be possibly seeing her at a function or something like that again in the future. And so this is his response to her, and I'm using an online annotator called dochub.com. So if you ever need an online annotation, if you like the way that this is doing things, you can use it for yourself in the future. I will say, though, if you are annotating along with me, I'll probably be talking more about various parts of this than I'll actually be annotating on it. So it might be better for you to print out the letter and annotate it by hand. Oops, sorry, that's my cat. Annotate it by hand. And then we'll go from there. All right, so you can see the front here, 1938, college sophomore Francis Turnball. She sent a short story to family friend F. Scott Fitzgerald. Below is his response to Francis, and it's published in a collection of his letters. All right, so paragraph 1, I'm going to read it, and then we're going to talk about it and go from there. November 9th, 1938. Dear Francis, I've read this story carefully, and Francis, I'm afraid the price for doing professional work is a good deal higher than you are prepared to pay at present. You've got to sell your heart, your strongest reactions, not the little minor things that only touch you lightly, the little experiences that you might tell at dinner. This is especially true when you begin to write, when you have not developed the tricks of interesting people on paper, when you have none of the technique which it takes time to learn, when, in short, you have only your emotions to sell. All right, so a couple things here as we take a look. Obviously, right, we are talking here that there's some interesting things happening. He calls her Francis here. So when we talk about this idea of ethos, he has ethos with her mostly, right? Yeah, he's a family friend, but this is the family friend she is writing to or asking for feedback from. So his ethos is he's an expert writer. However, her pathos, when we talk about the pathos of the audience, she is putting her work in front of an extremely accomplished author. And so in this sense, right, when you talk about what is she expecting from it, you would expect that she would put her best work that she was confident in front of him. She wouldn't just send like a little thought she had written on a napkin to him. So he is now trying to communicate to her his feelings about her work. Now you can see here he puts Francis. He's saying you, right? He says a lot of times he's talking to her directly. And so you have this idea of he wants to connect with her directly as a family friend. And so, he has some news to break to her. In fact, it's kind of harsh, you might even say. He's like, right, the price for doing professional work is a good deal higher than you are prepared to pay at present. And so what he's telling her right here is like he has concern that she's not ready to give what's necessary. She's not ready to give what's necessary, right? The price is a good deal higher you're prepared to pay. So he's expecting something from her writing that she's not giving. And so when we look at, well, what are those things, right? He's saying you have to be able to give your strongest reactions. He's saying that you have to be able to give, right, your emotions to sell. So his idea here is that she is in not being experienced. She has to actually draw on what she has. She does not have the tricks of interesting people on paper, right? She doesn't have the technique. So there's two things happening here, right? One would be, I don't want a text box. Here we go. So one, she has to rely on raw emotion. That's what she's needing to rely on. And then two, right, lacks experience and technique to deal with trivial, I guess, scenes and circumstances. Right, so his two concerns that he's bringing out here, right, is that she does not have the experience and know-how and abilities yet to actually talk about things that really don't matter. An experienced author with skills can talk about small, unimportant things in an interesting way. She's unable to do that, so she has to draw on actually her own life experience, her emotions. Right? Why? Because it takes time to learn those things. Okay? Needs time to develop those skills. Okay, so there's things that, she's not doing. And so the question would become, that sets up in this first paragraph, is what would she need to do differently, and how would she go about doing that? So when he's telling her it's got to be your strongest reactions, your emotions to sell. So this is going to require something a little more risky, maybe, as a writer, a little deeper, and it's going to take a price, right? Do you want to bare your soul on the page? Because that's the price for doing professional work. And that's where we see this right here, where he says the price for doing professional work. Right? And that is to start out by pouring out your heart. Okay, going down here then, he's kind of set up the idea, right, that a professional writer, when they're starting out, an experienced writer gets experience by starting by basically bleeding out onto the page, by showing their innermost feelings and like, I guess you could say, the storm or the tragedy or the heartache inside of them. Like, they have to draw on their deepest emotions, because that's what's going to be convincing until you learn the technique that it takes to turn a very light or trivial scene into something interesting or captivating or even powerful. The next part here, all right, he's already established then his we'll call it a claim. His claim that experienced writers start out by learning to pour out their deepest and most intense emotions onto the page before they can effectively communicate lighter material. And then we get to the second paragraph, and he says, this is the experience of all writers. Right? So now we're going to see actually examples of the claim. Right? It was necessary for Dickens to put into Oliver Twist the child's passionate resentment at being abused and starved that had haunted his whole childhood. So when we start looking at this, he's giving her examples of famous, accomplished writers. Now, as an author herself, or an aspiring author, right, you think about audience, he's assuming, and as a college sophomore interested in literature, that she knows who these people are and the background. So there's an assumption of audience. Dickens, who wrote Oliver Twist and A Christmas Carol, many other works, he would hopefully assume, or he would assume that she would know that when he was young, his father was a debtor. He was put in a debtor's prison, and Dickens had to actually go work as a child laborer. And so into Oliver Twist, he took his childhood experience and poured that into the book. Ernest Hemingway's first stories in our time went right down to the bottom of all that he had ever felt and known. So a little more vague here, but saying like, these first stories of Hemingway, he too was telling like raw emotion. In this side of paradise, I wrote. So this is an interesting little thing here. When we talk about ethos of the author, Fitzgerald is putting himself in the same lineup, if you will, of these other famous authors, right? Dickens, Hemingway, and me. So that's significant in that he knows, in terms of ethos, he's established his place kind of in this hierarchy of authors, that I'm amongst these great authors. And so even I, in this side of paradise, wrote about a love affair that was still bleeding, as fresh as the skin wound on a hemophile. Okay, so this is an interesting word here. As fresh as, so we have a simile here. This is a hemophile, someone who does not stop bleeding easily. So this is a very kind of powerful imagery where we see that I had this love affair that had terminated, and my heart was still in great pain, and it was like just continually in like this intense sorrow, and this is what I wrote this story out of. Okay, and so a couple things that we see happening here in this actual text, right? We have allusion here and examples for these previous authors. We have simile here with the blood of a hemophile. Okay, for sure, in terms of context. So this whole paragraph is actually example or concrete detail. It's evidence of what he said in the previous paragraph. Okay, so it's all famous authors and how they initially did what he had said above, sold their emotions. Okay, so again, as I said, Dickens had his childhood he was pouring out here. So we see that as an example. Abused and starved, that had haunted him. It's a pretty graphic imagery there in terms of how he felt. Okay. You have the second example, bottom of all that he had ever felt. So again, that example of emotions to sell, and then love affair that was still bleeding. Again, same idea here. So that's your example page. Okay, moving on then. It's not an example page, sorry. That's your example paragraph. Here's the claim that was established. The price of doing professional work starts with being able to put your strongest emotions, feelings, past history out onto the page for other people to read. And that helps educate you on to be more effective in your prose. Then you have this example 1, example 2, example 3, including me as a famous author. And then we have this paragraph. So I want you to notice real quick, here in this paragraph, you're not prepared to do professional work. You can only write about your strongest reactions. You're not going to be effective when you just try to handle light material this early on in your career. And then he says this paragraph at first: the amateur, seeing how the professional, having learned all that he'll ever learn about writing, can take a trivial thing such as the most superficial reactions of 3 uncharacterized girls and make it witty and charming, the amateur thinks he or she can do the same. All right, so the question becomes, right, why does he not say you, seeing how the professional, having learned all that, however, right? He could say it's her, but who would he group among the amateur? Because you see the parallel here. The professional learns and then can take a trivial thing, and here you have, right, not the little minor things that only touch you lightly, little experiences that you might tell at dinner. So this is the same thing right here. That's kind of a parallel, because she is the amateur, but he doesn't say you here. He just says the amateur. He says he here, and then he says he or she. The amateur can only realize his ability to transfer his emotions to another person by some such desperate and radical expedient as tearing your first tragic love story out of your heart and putting it on the pages for people to see. So then he includes the you, the first person here. So he starts off just a generalized word here: amateur, right? He, and then he or she. And when we talk about pathos here, he knows he has some hard news to break here, but it's not just singled out on her, right? He's not just like, you're not doing a good job in this writing, right? He wants to make sure, like, it's just any amateur. And of course you'd be an amateur because you're a beginning writer. So it's not a direct attack, in other words, right? He's more wanting to make sure, like, the amateur, the beginner. And it continues. So he continues to hammer home this point that he's making, right? These 3 paragraphs all hang together because it's dealing with one concept: the professional versus the amateur, and what the amateur is unable to do because the professional has learned to do it through this particular pathway. And that pathway is ability to transfer emotions to another person. How do you do that pathway? By a desperate and radical expedient as tearing your first tragic love story out of your heart. And here's another simile, right? Right there. And so here's the simile, because this is not really literally what you're doing. Tearing your first tragic love story out of your heart and putting on the pages for people to see. And maybe here's part of the risk, right? You have to be willing for people to see your deepest, hardest, most bitter, perhaps, emotions and feelings and experiences. Okay, so this is a kind of a sandwich here of claim, evidence, and then a recapitulation or a restatement of the claim. But a little more specific, right? Most superficial reactions of 3 uncharacterized girls. Characterized versus uncharacterized. This is a literary term. Characterization is the development of a character in a piece of writing. And so in this case, uncharacterized girls would be really not a main character in the story. It would be like someone that had not been developed, that you just drop in on their little light conversation at the table, but you really know nothing about them. And so when you don't have any buy-in, emotional buy-in to a character, the writing has to be excellent for you as a reader to find it interesting or to care. And this is why he's making this point. Like, how do you make a very flat character, rather than a robust character, a very flat character, interesting, and this idea of witty and charming, like you find the actual dialogue to be intriguing. All right, you learn to do that, to be convincing, because you were first convincing with yourself. All right, so I didn't type in much here, but we easily could. All right, we have a simile, as well. An example here, like a hypothetical. And then we have also the claim to be professional requires risk and sacrifice. Okay? So this is kind of the idea here. I mean, we could say more if we wanted to. This idea of, vague category of amateur to not be as, direct of an attack on her. All right, so these are kind of the ideas here. Moving on then is this next paragraph. What are we on? Paragraph 4. And here's what he says to her. That anyhow is the price of admission. Whether you're prepared to pay it or whether it coincides or conflicts with your attitude on what is nice is something for you to decide. But literature, even light literature, will accept nothing less from the neophyte, which is a word for amateur. Right, so we consider audience. You use words like hemophile and neophyte. That's more sophisticated vocabulary. His expectation is, as an aspiring author who's a sophomore in college, that you know these words already, and if you don't, you're going to look them up, because here you go, you have this famous author that's writing you and sharing his thoughts with you. But literature, even light literature, will accept nothing less from the neophyte. It is one of those professions that wants the works. You wouldn't be interested in a soldier who was only a little brave. So this is kind of like the capstone of the argument. The 3 paragraphs so far is him explaining what the price of admission. The price of admission is what he has explained so far in this letter. The price is pouring your heart on the page. Now, here he posits a question to her, right, in a way. Whether you're prepared to pay it or not, or whether it coincides or conflicts with your attitude on what is nice. And so he's read her writing, and what he's concluding here, right, is that she's trying to just come across as a nice writer, right? Like to be pleasant or to have like nothing that's offensive, perhaps. So he's having to ask her, right? You may be prepared to pay this price or you may not. You have to decide. So he's putting the ball in his court. But again, he reiterates the claim here. But literature will accept nothing less. Even light literature. Right? So even if you want to do more pleasant, cozy kind of writing that generates like warm feelings, this is required even for that. It's one of those professions that wants the works. And again, this is pretty vague, but the works meaning like you have to give your heart and soul. And then he has this metaphor here. You wouldn't be interested in a soldier who is only a little brave, right? We don't read stories like that. The characters have to be attractive in the sense that there's something captivating or interesting about them to get us to buy in. So here's a metaphor in order to explain that. All right, so you might say that this paragraph is pivotal. It's a summation paragraph, and it's putting the ball in her court. So when we talk about in a piece of writing, what's the tonal shift, where there is a movement from one idea to the other, we're getting ready for that, right? This is kind of all that to say, that anyhow, all that to say, that's what it's going to take. Are you ready to take that risk? And so this paragraph is kind of let me get to a text here, right? Summative, conclusion, restatement of the claim here. We see that there's a metaphor to drive the point home of what makes captivating writing. All right. So it's this word here too. When we see this word nice, what is nice? You might say, is that a little condescending? Especially he puts it in quotes, trying to capture the sentiment of her writing, right? You're just trying to write something pleasant, not really making a great statement. So he is kind of, in a way, this is an indictment of what she is producing right now. That's not really good literature. So then we get to this next paragraph. In light of this, right? So here's your tonal shift, because he's moving on. So I've now explained to you the difference between amateur and professional, and where you'd be categorized right now, and why you're not there yet, and what you need to do. And then he moves on to this next idea. So when we talk about tonal shifts, we don't want to approach a piece of writing to think it's going to be divided nicely down the middle. Like the author is going to spend half this time on this, and then he's going to move. You see that a majority, this is the rest of it right here. This right here is the rest of it. There's only there's a paragraph, a signing off, and then an aside, like a PS. But you have 4 paragraphs on top of that, much more significant in terms of the content, before we get to this tonal shift. And so this is what he says. In the light of this, it doesn't seem worthwhile to analyze why this story isn't sellable, but I am too fond of you to kid you along about it, as one tends to do at my age. If you ever decide to tell your stories, no one would be more interested than your old friend F. Scott Fitzgerald. So this is an interesting paragraph where he basically says, I'm not going to speak specifically to the piece of writing you sent me. So you might think that that's really harsh, like it's not even worth talking about your writing because it's not good. In a way, he's saying that without saying it. But then again, when we talk about ethos, he has this line he's walking. As a professional writer, I can tell you have some growth to do. But now, as your family friend, I'm kind of maybe softening the blow, or I'm letting you know why I'm being so honest, right? Because he could have really just said, hey, nice story, nice job, good luck. But he says, I'm too fond of you to kid you along about it, as one tends to do at my age. So you have this kind of, we'll call it a retreat into ethos, the two sources of credibility, but he's trying to let her know he's being this honest or blunt. Why? Because he cares. We have this relationship, right? But again, as a professional, so here's where he's walking this line. It's not worth to analyze. I've told you the problem here, so it's not worth it to go into the specifics. And then he lets her know that, what would you say this is? When we talk about if you ever decide to tell your stories, no one would be more interested than your old friend. So it's this idea of letting her know, like, I do care about you. I would want to be there for you. And so you have kind of this, maybe is this an attempt at comfort? Because he's letting her know, like, as a family friend, I'm in your court. I'm on your side. I back you up. Because he's been, pretty blunt here up until that point. In fact, I'm not going to read it, but I'm too fond of you. I like you, so I'm not going to play nice and pretend. You asked me to give feedback, and here it was. All right, so this is now a tonal shift in terms of his focus here. He's now focusing on her as a person and their relationship. Okay, last paragraph here, the PS. Pretty significant piece here. P.S. I might say that the writing is smooth and agreeable, and some of the pages very apt and charming. You have talent, which is the equivalent of a soldier having the right physical qualifications for entering West Point. All right, so here you have another allusion. Let's talk about this, what he's doing here, right? So he does here give her some encouragement. Like, I see some of your writing. You have some skill, right? Right? You have an ability with language, I guess we would say. You have an ability with language, right? You have talent, recognizes potential. But then you have this. You have talent, which is the equivalent of a soldier having the right. So here you have a metaphor, and this is where you have, and then you have an allusion to West Point. And this is where prior knowledge is pretty important and crucial. Do you know what West Point is? Again, he's assuming that she would know. And that's the whole point of this, is knowing this prior knowledge to this allusion in this metaphor is what he's really saying here, right? West Point is a very competitive military college that you don't just get into. You have to have the academics. You have to have the physical qualifications and abilities. It's very rigorous. And so you have to be at the top of your game to be able to get into it. But there's a huge difference from the person entering West Point to the person graduating from West Point, right? So you have talent, which is the equivalent of a soldier having the right physical qualifications for entering West Point. So in a way, right, he's saying you have skill, but it's raw. It needs to be put through the paces, so to speak. So that's the power of this metaphor here that's alluding to this West Point, is that he is recognizing in her, I guess you'd say, the raw materials or the raw abilities, but she's not skilled or developed yet. And so the second part of here, after the second part of this letter, after the tonal shift, is a focus on who she is and their relationship, and to give a little bit of encouragement. All right, so there you have the whole letter. Hopefully you were able to annotate. I know I said a lot more than I was able to write onto this thing and type onto this thing. I didn't want to distract too much from the conversation here, but hopefully that's enough to get you through to understanding really what's going on in this letter and the nuances of it as well. All right, take care. That was helpful. Here's actually some more videos that have to do with like AP language and the English language that could be really helpful for other assignments. Plus over here, something for fun, and then maybe another Englishy kind of thing that you might find useful. All right, take care. We'll see you next time.